everybody. TGIF, happy Friday. Welcome to the second, I think, speaker of this semester in our colloquium series, The World on Edge. So we today have with us Mary Thomas from the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and she's also affiliated faculty in this department. So welcome, Mary, and thanks all for coming.
Hello.
I turned mine on, Joel.
I just turned on my camera. I'm just waiting for it to come on.
Okay.
Can you see me? Hey, everybody. Good to see you. Hey, thank you, Darla, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mary Thomas. As Darla just mentioned, Mary's an associate professor here in the Department of Women, Genders, and Sexuality Studies, and she holds a courtesy appointment in our own Department of Geography, as well as in the Department of Comparative Studies. After taking her bachelor's degree in political science and history at the College of Charleston, Mary traveled to Minnesota, where she entered the University of Minnesota for her graduate training in geography. And if I may speak briefly on a personal note, I'll say that I met Mary in Minnesota when we were both in graduate school. That was in 1996, and we became fast friends. So we're now celebrating a quarter century of friendship, which is pretty awesome. Mary's research has long focused on explaining subjectivity and theories of the subject, mainly by drawing upon psychoanalytical and feminist theories to explain the raced and gendered subject in distinct spatial settings, from schools in California to juvenile detention in prisons here in Ohio to the extractive zones in North Dakota. Let me briefly mention one example of each of those. First, Mary is the author of a wonderful book named Multicultural Girlhood, Racism, Sexuality, and the Conflicted Spaces of American Education, which I highly recommend. She's also the editor of several books, and she's presently co-editing with Bruce Braun a book entitled Settling the Boom, The Sites and Subjects of Bakken Oil. And additionally, Mary is, or was until recently, the statewide coordinator of the Ohio Inside Out program, and is presently the director of the Ohio Prison Education Exchange Program. OPEEP is the acronym there, which is awesome. Let me say that again because it's really important. The Ohio Prison Education Exchange Program. So this is a program whereby faculty at Ohio State and other universities are entering prisons and teaching in prisons in order to facilitate education inside and out of the prison system here in Ohio. It's an extremely important initiative, and I think making a small step towards the fulfillment of the responsibility of the university to reach the full community here in Ohio. So I could go on, but suffice to say, I'm delighted to have Mary here speaking in the department today. We're very fortunate to have her present her talk on the relational spaces of the juvenile prison. Thank you very much, Mary, for being here.
Thanks, Joel. And before you go, Joel, my camera doesn't like this low light. Should I turn on my overhead again, or do you think it's okay? It's okay.
Well, you know, it's up to the audience, but I would say that you look a little dark, but
I'm gonna turn the light on. Hold on, y'all.
Okay.
Okay, we have this whole like camera check, and then
that is better. That's better.
Okay, it's not an MSNBC. We don't need to be all worried about it. Okay, thank you for that warm welcome, Joel, and hi everyone. I really appreciate you all being here on a Friday for yet another Zoom event. But I'm really impressed that the Department of Geography has kept its colloquium series going during the pandemic. So thank you for making me a part of it. I really appreciate it. I also just want to acknowledge that the OPEEP project is very much a co-production with my colleague, Dr. T. Morris. And you can check out our webpage at opeep.osu.edu. So it's opeep.osu.edu. So check it out. So again, I know we're all running on fumes, so I really appreciate you all for attending. You know, I was really thinking actually that I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to do this. It's just a lot of extra work right now, but it was really productive for me to be thinking in a different way than I have been in the pandemic. So I do really appreciate the opportunity to present some ideas, although I think I only figured out what I really wanted to talk about 15 minutes ago. So it's very much a work in progress and pretty rough. So I'd love some feedback. Type up those questions even during the event. If as I talk, if something occurs to you, just go ahead and type it up. or send me your thoughts later over email. My dot number is 1672. And then finally, I just want to also shout out to all of the prospective grad students from WGSS who are tuned in for today. So it's nice to see you all, sort of not see you all, but it's nice that you're out there, and thanks for coming. And so be in touch also if you have any questions about the department. Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to start with a quick content warning. Just because so many of us have been really isolated during the pandemic. And I will be talking about topics of violence, including domestic and relationship violence, sexual and gender violence, racialized and racist violence, suicide contemplation and self-harm, and the violence of the carceral state and its caging of children and youth. Drug use and addiction also make appearances. So heads up. And if anyone is still left out there after that, I'm going to go ahead and begin. So I'm going to start by telling you about Bev, who I met now 10 years ago almost at a juvenile correctional facility here in Central Ohio. And those of you who I know, you've heard me tell this story before. Bev is obviously not her real name, and she's no longer a child. She's a grown woman now. So in a sense, the person I'm describing here no longer exists as such. But I'm going to use the present tense as I describe her life because her story is relevant for the present moment. Bev is a young African-American woman, and she just turned 17. She'd already been incarcerated for 7 months when I meet her, and she had another year before she was released. But when I met her, she didn't yet know when she would be released. Her judge gave her 4 years as a 16-year-old. Within 2 minutes of meeting Bev for the interview, she tells me she is a good person and a strong person. These are her exact phrases. She tells me that it's hard to be a normal person, however, because when she was 10 years old, her mother shot and killed her father after another evening of beating. Her mother is incarcerated for this crime. Bev and her 3 siblings went to live with an aunt. Unfortunately, the aunt was overwhelmed by their needs and misbehaviors, and Bev went into foster care eventually. She bounced around, she ran away, she ended up in a group home, back with an aunt. By 15, she was sort of living with a boyfriend, who she still loves, who also beat her. She shows me the scars not covered by clothing on her face, her neck, and her hands. She turned herself into the police when she had a warrant, actually, because she had no other way to get away from him. Her face was cut and her lip was split and swollen when she went to the station to turn herself in. She told me she was also tired of selling her body for money, for hustling. She wanted to finish high school. The detention facility was the most stable place she'd been in since she was 11. This is a lot of tragedy and trauma for such a young person. Every girl in the facility where I did these interviews has a horrific past. They lost parents to addiction, mental illness, or prison. They cooked meth for their mothers. They injected heroin. They sold drugs. They watched as their brothers, fathers, and friends were shot in front of them. They were sex workers. They lost their own children to foster care. They survived. One girl I met at the facility died within a year of her release, so survived might be the wrong word. I don't know much about how most of the others did upon their releases. I can't see any of you. I can't even comprehend an audience out there, but I'm guessing some of you, and I hope all of you understand that helping, housing, and supporting a kid like Bev doesn't require a prison. Indeed, putting children and adolescents in cages permanently harms them, exacerbates trauma, confines them inside with people who harm them, adult staff in particular. Prison impedes adolescent sexual development, warps teenagers' play and joy, restricts being loud, dancing, laughing. It restricts being outside, bodily experimentation. It prohibits privacy. Prison curtails the bounds of sociality and relationality so severely that one is never alone and never allowed unsupervised time with others, with other youth. It's not just the surveillance that's troublesome, but it's also the arbitrary hammer from adult staff who decide how and whom to punish for rules and behavioral infractions. 10 years ago, the youth prison population in Ohio, and indeed in most states in the US, was a lot higher than it is now. It was even higher 20 years ago. Thankfully, there's more company in this belief that children and youth don't belong in cages or in prison. Today, there are almost no girls incarcerated in Ohio. Those adjudicated of felonies often are placed in residential mental health facilities or other kinds of opportunities called community alternatives. I can talk more about these later if you all are interested. Something to keep in mind, the US has seen increases and decreases in the numbers of youth incarcerated for decades now. So far, past decreases became increases again, right, eventually, as high profile and often violent offenses turn public opinion against decarceration. The contemporary negative slope of rates and numbers is therefore not a place to rest a happy ending. In fact, what we do know from all the hills and valleys of incarceration rates in the US is that how the public feels about crime and offenders, informed by profit-driven and anti-Black lobbying in media, among a whole lot more, this is not a simple story. That drives the altitude. The humanizing stories about incarcerated people can still some of that upward momentum and even reverse its course, right? The alternative can happen. Many prison abolitionists worry that feelings are so mercurial that they should be no standalone foundation for political and social movements. What instills a decarceration reaction today can be turned on a dime by a horrific act of violence, of harm and suffering. It can quickly turn the tide in our fast information and white supremacist heteropatriarchal society. This is why prison abolitionists emphasize storytelling as a means to challenge power structures, not just to overfocus on any individual, even the teller. For example, you can read an excellent social media guide from the Community Justice Exchange, and I can show you this really quickly. You can see that. So this is, you can see the communityjusticeexchange.org website here, and they have a media toolkit. So if you go to that website, you can view the toolkit. And one of the things they do is to actually coach you on how to post on social media. And I'll leave this up on the screen so you can look at one example. Hold on. Anyway, there's lots of these. It's not what I wanted. I have it on another tab open, but the problem is, there it is. You can see the reinforcing binary. Okay, so this is a really excellent social media guide that talks about the methods for abolitionist communication, and they have other really excellent materials on that website. So the project of humanizing incarcerated people is a bedrock of abolitionism. We have lots of powerful work from decolonial, Black, queer, trans, feminist perspectives. From movements like No One is Illegal, to restorative justice movements, to understanding the trauma and neglect girding so many acts of violence, to social and legal movements to decriminalize addiction, homelessness, Blackness, gender nonconformity, and migrant status. The abolitionist quest has been call out the white supremacist and heteromasculinist assumptions about who is an offender and who is a victim. The quest has been to ask who can decide, shape law, and determine public policies that address the harmful impacts of poverty, intergenerational violence, sexual and gender violence, hunger, addiction, and on. These abolitionist works are not equivalent, and while they share some values and frameworks, there are also deep divisions at play, both in the contours of the context they examine and the proposed stakes to take. There are some too who suggest getting rid of the category human altogether, as it's deeply anthropocentric and forged in colonialism, also propped by white supremacy and adultist heteropatriarchy. All of this abolition work and activism is formidable in impact and scale. Stop sharing. But what we know only too well after the past 4 years, and after the past year for sure, is that storytelling is a mobilizing force, even when it has a very loose hold on policy or even facts. We know storytelling propels injustice as much as it can be a formidable weapon against oppression. As someone whose work involves psychoanalysis, At this point, that perceived reality differs by one's subjectivity and positionality is unsurprising. We can also see that the saturation of sexuality and sexualization in mobilizing storytelling. We can also talk about this in the Q&A, and I'm going to return to sexuality in a minute. But you can just think about examples from like QAnon to realize the way that sexuality is also seeps into so many other kinds of loopholes on fact. But for now, keep in mind this argument, okay? This is an argument to keep in mind. We must continue to think about how humanizing criminalized or incarcerated people only serves an abolitionist quest to a certain extent. I think that psychoanalysis can help to understand the limits of humanizing stories and storytelling. Humanizing must remain a core strategy of abolition, but we need to be aware of the constraints, even as we work within them more generally. So importantly, I suggest that we also interrogate them from within abolition itself. Let's go back to Bev. I haven't told you much about her, just some vague details about her opening narrative to me, outlining a traumatic pathway to that juvenile correctional facility. She frames the telling of these facts through an insistence on her goodness and her strength. I do wonder how that makes you feel. And again, like it's impossible for me to even gauge your reaction, but I wonder if you're ready to dwell with her in that self-belief of being good. If you're like many audience members I've encountered over the years, you may want to know what she did to be adjudicated and detained. Or maybe you're caught by the fact that her mother's in prison for defending herself, and you know this exacerbates intergenerational traumas. Or maybe you're wondering about why Bev worked in the sex trade as a teen. It's also awfully easy to feel an overwhelming anger at the failures of a whole host of state agencies to help Bev, or anger at the willful ignorance of the so-called general public, which really means middle class and wealthy white people, right? To care about this person who we pay to cage. No matter your reaction, Bev herself seeks to route the telling of herself through her goodness. And this is an easy route to follow through an abolitionist commitment. But I want us to think carefully about following her along this logic. I'm going to argue that this is both her need and our responsibility to reject. I also want to argue that her narrative is relational and not hers alone. I'm going to show you the transcript of this beginning moment of our meeting as a shared point of reference. It's lightly edited for clarity. Bev and I have just met for a second time. Since the first time we met, I had to deal with all that human subjects paperwork. And I met her initially on a prior visit to the facility with a whole group of youth. But this time, she and I alone settle into a room for the interview, where there's a glass window that allows staff and other girls to see us and vice versa. But we have a closed door and no one else is in the room with us. No one can hear us. There's a security camera without sound capture on the wall that feeds into the facility's central security room where staff sit in a small room. It's at the main crash gate at the front building that monitors all facility cameras. That's where staff and visitors are also buzzed in and out. These cameras are live feed, but they're also recorded and stored. I don't know for how long, maybe forever. These recordings do get pulled up when staff are accused of sexually abusing the incarcerated youth or when youth attack staff. Both of these happen with alarming regularity, though mostly it's boys who attack staff at the facility. Yes, there are boys at this facility too, in different units. They're held separately. Usually it's girls who self-harm or fight each other. Girls don't. The whole time I was there, they never attacked a staff member. So lest you assume that I want you to think that the interview space and time is somehow unproblematic because we're in a semi-private room, made somewhat accountable through this visibility, let me assure you that it is also highly sexualized, gendered, and racialized. It is a relational and intergenerational space between Bev and me in this carceral context. I'll return to this, but I do think it's important not to abstract these words from the interview from the context of the talking. I'm going to pull these up real quick so that you can dwell on them a bit. So we sit across a table from one another, a recorder between us. I indicate the nature of my research, which is focused on peer relationships at the prison. This theme was also explained on the IRB form she signed, so she already knows this. I turn the recorder on and I begin. Okay, here we go. Why don't you tell me your name? How old are you? And how long you've been here? And another thing is, you don't have to tell me anything about what happened to get you here if you don't want. I'm not going to ask you about that directly. I'm more interested in what happens when you get here and when you meet people. Why don't you just start by telling me a little bit about yourself? My name is Bev, and I lived in Ohio City. I've been in the juvenile correctional facility for 7 months, going on 8. And I mean, I'm a good person. I mean, I've been through a lot. And this been because my trauma, my anger built up, because my mom killed my dad. And it's very hard for me to just be a normal person. You know, it's hard. And just being here in juvenile correctional facility, it's really, really stressful. It's depressing. I mean, I've had thoughts of suicide, but I usually go to my social worker and talk to him because I know there's better ways to go. And I'm not a person that gives up. I'm a strong person. I try to take advantage of every program they have for me, especially when it comes to my school, because I do want to graduate. I know I made a bad choice by coming in here and stuff, but there's always reasons for that, you know, because I'm really not a bad kid. Okay, let's just start with a question. Why does Bev introduce herself to me in these terms as a good person? Obviously, she's addressing me, stranger, an adult white cis woman whom she does not know well. She's likely anxious about what I think of her, what I will think of her. I say, I'm not going to ask you about your charge, which in hindsight is the exact same thing as asking her for it, right? I wasn't conscious of this at the time. And in fact, this was one of the very first interviews I did, and I was incredibly nervous. I was trying to project a gentle sensibility of non-judgment and openness and curiosity. But unlike the textual transcript that we can examine closely, this conversation was embodied, indeterminate, and nervous. All interviews are relational, with all kinds of messaging flying around, both conscious and unconscious. Also, the facility has trained her to prison talk. Remorse, gratitude, and change. These must be ever present in youth speak, whether in group sessions, meeting with social and caseworkers, judges, you name it. If remorse, gratitude, and change are not upfront and humbly offered, you're not rewarded. As part of the programming to instill narratives with remorse, gratitude, and change, the staff, and all of the materials used in youth rehabilitation, taught Bev to distinguish between what she does and who she is. In that way, they seek to center the who she is so that she can make better what she does, right? Better decisions. In this framing, who she is an inherent person, an agent, a cognizant moral deliberator, a chooser. What she does is the outcome of who she chooses to be. The person herself is redeemable, but only through an adjudication of what she does and what she's gone through, as some trauma-informed techniques have rightly insisted. In other words, the stories she tells. This rehabilitative technique leaves untouched the fact of the be, the is, who she chooses to be. That is untouched. The self is a constant as a potential actor who either succeeds or fails. It doesn't matter how horrible someone's childhood was or is, how it imprints their subjectivity. It only matters what the person does to correct their behavior in the time and the space of the prison. Often in the case of this facility through cognitive behavioral therapy. And I've written about CBT previously, so that's not a topic that I'm going to dive into today. If anyone wants to read that paper, I'm happy to send you the PDF. Just email me. I would also point out that every youth in the facility at the time, despite their mental health, was deemed capable of achieving the proper outcomes. And again, this is a topic I can talk about if anyone's interested in questions. Correction is judged based on what the girl does correctly to illustrate who she chooses to be during her rehabilitation, or what she does not do, right? I also want to emphasize that success and failure are the only options. Bev does want to situate her narrative as a good person, and this is important for many reasons. The youth try to mask the what they do and will do through compelling salesmanship on who they are. Also, across the board, the girls I met all reduce the who they are, into two categories, good or bad. Bev is setting the terms of our conversation by identifying herself as a good one. Good or bad, it's not racialized, sexualized, or gendered per se in the girls' reductions. All the girls did the self-categorization across race, gender identity, sexual identity, and practice. Also across age, whether they were young or older. So for now, I'm just going to bracket those, but just keep in mind, I'm not talking about labeling other people good or bad. I'm talking about how they label themselves. The self is either good or bad. Of course, no girl claimed to have been a bad person, but they did believe that there were bad people around them. Some of the other girls thought Bev was one of the bad people on the unit. Bev thought that most of those other girls were bad. For example, just a couple of minutes after our conversation began, hold on, she explained to me, I can adapt with my environment that I'm with now, but I only let them know a certain amount of things about me. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there's good people who are in here. It's not that many. It's probably like 2 people out of everybody in this place. And there were about, at the time, about 40, 45 other youth in the unit at that time in that place, plus the staff. Within 10 minutes, Beth told me a bit more about her family history, the charge she caught, and that she's been in trouble for sexual misconduct several times. Her social worker spoke with her judge because her history of sexual misconduct was severe enough as primary rules infractions to go back to her judge. The social worker explained to her that the judge who adjudicated her delinquent, who will determine when she is rehabilitated enough to be released, said, and these are her words, obviously, my social worker came back and he said, it seems all you need to work on is not touching anybody, no passing notes and no dancing, and you will make it through. And I said, no dancing on what? I was thinking like on the table or something, right? But she said on the unit, no dancing on the unit, because the way we dance in it'd be like nasty and stuff. So how we get charged with sexual misconduct? She immediately said that she had to follow the rules. I'd rather do it, follow the rules, than to be here for the next 2 years. And I mean, it'd be hard, but the person say do this, and it's a step. I have to learn it. Just say okay, because they gave me orders and I need to follow. I'm really not a bad kid. I just made a bad decision. Sorry about all that back and forth, but I don't really have a PowerPoint, so I don't want to keep it sharing. Okay, I do feel it's important to tell you that Bev is not incarcerated for a sexual offense of any kind whatsoever. Yet, sexuality is where the judge places his concern for her rehabilitation. Sexuality pervaded the juvenile correctional facility. Every interview I did, and in time, just the regular conversations I had during my visits there, exemplified the pervasiveness of sexuality. Bev always had a girlfriend on the unit. She played truth or dare with the other girls. She left notes for the boys. There were boys at the facility, but they were in different buildings. They would leave notes for them, like in the gym or the cafeteria. She tried to write smutty books. Well, she did write smutty books, but I say tried to write because they were really terrible. But she tried to write these smutty books to publish upon her release because she thought that could be a sustaining career. They were just stories about sex. It was just sex, sex, sex. She told me also that she flirted with particular staff and that they grabbed her body in turn. She also told me that other staff sexually harassed her. She even told me that she seduced a guard and had sex with him. I don't know what is true or not in this litany of stories, and it doesn't matter. She centered sex and sexuality. And again, many of the girls did the same, though in unique ways and through very different practices. The facility centered sexuality as well through all of their training about how to be better And also, as you could see in that example from the judge. But the girls punished each other sexually. They did this by degrading bodies and sexual beliefs and practices. They encouraged rules and infractions by egging each other on to engage in sex play with each other or with staff and the boys at the facility. They had sex with each other and then ratted each other out afterwards to staff. They wrote sexy letters to friends and lovers on the outs. They received letters. They speculated about staff sexuality, and they even tried to intervene in staff romantic relationships if they thought they were having sex. These are all the overt sexual practices. The overt captures attention. Even the spatial configuration of the facility infrastructured, reinforced, contended with this overt sexuality. Those cameras, the rooms without cameras. I can talk about that for days. So if you want to know about that, let me know. The rules, right? The punishment, the judge, even media attention given to sexual assault and harassment by staff, not at just this facility, but also at others in the state. The lurid fascination with sex in prison keeps researchers like me from writing about it, frankly. Again, happy to talk more about this in Q&A. The pervasive sexual harassment and assault by staff was also a reason the state closed this facility. But sexuality isn't just sex, and psychoanalysis provides theoretical help in understanding this argument and not getting trapped into all of those sex stories, which I purposefully have not excerpted from the interviews to show you. For one, I believe that sexuality is the foundation of the good versus bad narrative. This is the argument to remember from this talk, if you remember nothing else. Sexuality and sex talk always lean on other subjective processes: shame, desire, repression, inhibition, seduction, fantasy, primary attachment. Jean Laplanche, who is a French psychoanalyst, writes that what distinguishes psychoanalysis from psychology is the specificity of its object, the unconscious and sexuality. Laplanche argues that sexuality arrives to the human child both too soon and too late. First, too soon. Sexuality arrives as a barrage of adult messages to the infant child, who cannot accommodate them. The infant cannot understand and integrate adult sexuality, though it is all around and being communicated through relations with others, like parents and caregivers. Second, sexuality arrives too late, because by the time the adolescent child develops a physical sexual maturity, the messages have already been received, though not understood. The unconscious has formed as a method of inhibiting all of these adult messages, the barrage of adult messages, some of which even the adults don't know they're sending, right? Because the adult, after all, also has an unconscious. Now, it's not important what I'm trying to argue to know how all this happens psychoanalytically, though I will admit that I geek out on that theory. But what is important is to remember that sexuality arrives both too soon and too late. And that confrontation with the adult world is the primal situation for the child, which forms the unconscious. Also, I just gotta say, in psychoanalysis, sexuality is not genital sexuality. Sexuality is what Laplanche says is a whole range of excitations and activities. So these would include bodily care, erogenous and autoerogenous zones, sucking from hunger and sucking, all of those activities. Laplanche writes, quote, "One can become human without a family, but not without an adult world," end quote. The child attributes meaning to the adult world, and this meaning making harkens a whole life of self-theorizing. The unconscious is always active in the process of self-theorizing. Laplanche writes, "The human being is and never stops being a self-translating and self-theorizing being. That's because sexuality arrives too soon and too late. So the child begins to have to tell themselves stories and begin to self-theorize in order to try and make sense of all of the messages they're being bombarded with that they cannot comprehend." Okay, I think that the way that the good and the bad person comes into girls' stories provides a clue of another nature, not whether they're good or bad people, whatever. This phrase doesn't mean what it means. This good bad person thing provides a myth for the self through which the youth self-theorizes, but always in relation to others, both past and present, and perhaps in relation to the future self they hope to become. And always it's a process of sexuality, because the need to self-theorize is unconscious and thus related to the primal. Bev is at a stage of too late sexuality. She is also in a space and context of pathological sexuality. There's sexual surveillance. There's adult youth sexual assault. There's also pansexual desire and promiscuity. And I think it's really would be fascinating to think about the potential that that offers alternatively to the pathological sexuality presented in this context. Bev is self-theorizing, and any youth, any subject is self-theorizing within this relational spatiality. Bev offers a self-theory when she brings herself to me as a good person, a strong person, not a normal person. I'm an adult and a white cis woman. That has to matter here because surely she would frame herself differently to another person. She certainly does to others on the unit, including other staff who she tries to seduce. She doesn't try to seduce me except through her goodness. That's related to my request for her to recognize me, to accept my offer of non-judgment. After all, as she tries to make sense of my nonsense, don't tell me something I want to know, right? I'm asking her to allow me to listen. I'm asking her to follow my questions and my not questions. She says, okay, but only if you know I'm good. Inside, I'm a good person, no matter what shit I'm about to say. Okay, let me wrap up. Often, prison abolitionists strongly urge messaging that resists the deserving and undeserving binary. That is what I just showed you earlier from that social media publication. For instance, those who are wrongly accused being held up as a reason to abolish prisons. That's the deserving half of the binary. There's always then going to be the undeserving half, which completely vacates the argument, right? It's an obvious trap. It leaves uninterrogated those who aren't wrongly accused. It leaves uninterrogated the injustice of prison altogether. I think, to boot, the disciplined messaging that abolition requires is always on a precipice of being out of control. The reason for this discipline is precisely because discourse is unmanageable. To be clear, I am not arguing that we just need a better guide to effective communication. I'm arguing something slightly different. First, abolition movement should not be seduced by the relational situation of the good person, by displacing or repressing what that leans on. I believe that even the idea of healing and healed communities represses a primal, foundational inability of any subject to self-evidently and indivisibly know how they are responding to the messages they receive. We cannot just communicate our way to a world free of violence. I know this might be quite a contentious belief, but it is mine. That does not mean we should not always try, but the trying is the outcome. Healing is a process, not an outcome. Second, I'm saying we should also reject compulsion to foreground the interiorized good person who does bad things. Routes to healing often remain committed to this interiorized good, a capable subject, again, indivisible, which elevates a sovereign subject and reinforces it. There is no such thing as the good person or the bad person. What does that even imply for an ideal of healthy communities? Does the idea of a good person or good people prop up the claim for healthy communities? I don't know, actually. I would love to hear from you all what you think about this. Again, abolition, though, must always be a struggle, not an outcome. Third, when the context of the story or storytelling changes, as it inevitably does, the relation also changes. Self-theorizing is situational and relational. No relation can be elevated above its context. No story will work for abolition in this nether, untethered to a specific context and relationality. Fourth, self-theorizing leans on sexuality, and sexuality makes its appearances in a range of uncontrollable ways. That's life, that is in life. Abolition movements must center sexuality not just as a thing to manage or include or overcome through healing and proper channels. We must expect it to show up in unexpected ways and through unexpected routes, and to indicate other things. We must not be afraid of the sexual or seek to command it. Finally, adult justice researchers, juvenile justice researchers like myself, must do more to conceptualize the messaging of the adult world when we work with and on behalf of youth and adolescents. So often, juvenile justice researchers focus on the evident injustices of youth incarceration, ignoring the paths of latent desire and inhibition, including our own. We repress the effects of our own unconscious and are afraid of the moralizing discourses of sexuality. We must not be afraid of the sexual or seek to command it. And that's what I got. Hope that wasn't too long.
Not at all. That was right. That was perfect. Thank you so much, Mary. Wonderful. So everyone, we have plenty of time for questions now for Mary. What I'd like to ask you to do is to take a moment to write a question to Mary. If you look at the bottom of your, let me share my screen briefly so that everyone, just in case there's anyone here who hasn't seen this before, let me pull this back up, come back, let's see here. No, that's not working for me. Never mind. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can see chat and you can see Q&A. You can use either one to present a question to Mary, or if you feel so bold, you can raise your hand and Mary can call on you and then you can go live on camera. So please, let's take a moment and write some questions to Mary. That's using
cool.
the question.
I would like you to do that. Raise your hand. I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah, raising your hand can be done by touching raise hand. So you've got three options. Q&A, chat, or...
Y'all don't be scary about asking questions. I know it's a little bossy, but I would love to hear what didn't make sense or, you know.
Mary, could I open the questions just to get things started here on that note? I have to confess, I got a little confused at the end about one point, and I wanted to see if you could elaborate in an extemporaneous fashion to help me make the connections more clearly. I thought your argument was really clear about the trouble of what you called the humanizing and of the good and the bad person, and the impulse to self-humanize or to label oneself as a good or bad person. But then at the very end of your talk, we had what I might characterize as like a powerful manifesto of what to do as an abolitionist.
Yeah.
I wasn't entirely clear though about the relationship between the two, because it seems to me that, to put it very bluntly, it seems to me that although as abolitionists, we want to make sure we do things right and be aware of these complicated psychological and power dynamics. I wonder, is it not the case that the really repressive power apparatus that we're confronting here is implicit in the scene of the prison itself? For instance, I mean, how can I put this? Like, as you said in the talk, if you enter the prison and you speak with incarcerated youth, they feel compelled to already speak from a script in which they present themselves as good people, to humanize themselves in that way. So, I'm sorry, Mary, I'm not making.
No, I get it.
Help me
okay.
make the connection more clear.
So I think what I think, I actually had written this whole thing for the talk about the humanizing impulses of abolition.
Okay.
And then I deleted it because I really just wanted to talk about the sexuality part. So I got rid of that. So that's why you're right that I have, there's some other steps in there that I got rid of. I just didn't want it to be too long because it's Friday and there's only so much people can listen to. So, especially over Zoom. But I think that abolition movements have, despite their criticisms of the human, through excellent sort of understandings of the colonial definition of what the human is, for example, they still tend to have an assumption about the sovereign subject, right? Which is a human subject.
That's right.
All right, and it's a moral subject as well, because the person who chooses abolition has a moral calling to do so, right? So it's not just, it still maintains that kind of humanizing impulse. And so I think that is also a way that healing is then brought through to abolition, because then healing is based on the notion of a psychology of a human sovereign, rather than what I'm trying to suggest is that we need to think about the psychoanalytic subject who is not sovereign. There's no sovereignty, right? And that if we take the example of the incarcerated people, if we psychologize as a method of activism, we fall prey to the dangers of that subject being out of control, both of themselves and in the discourse, which then can put us back into the upward slope of incarceration rates, because that messaging is going to fail. It's bound to fail.
That's right.
Right. So that's sort of what I was trying to get at. But I think what you're saying is that the prison creates the pathology. So if we just point out the prison's pathology, then we can avoid, I think, is that what you're saying? Avoid the kind of tendencies of how Bev is talking in this. Is that what you're?
I have a rejoinder. I have a reply, which is simply that I think I struggle to, because I don't understand psychoanalysis, I struggle to maintain the clarity of my understanding of power in that register, while also thinking about the institutional apparatus of the prison. That's my struggle. I fail to.
Okay, well, one way also to think about this is that if we stop thinking about the prison as a unique sexual pathology,
right,
then we can stop displacing the sexual when it does appear in other abolitionist work. Because if we sort of segregate it into the prison itself, and then it comes up in all these other ways in abolitionist work, then you're vacated of any kind of claim to a power structure that once you attend to that power structure, then will be in the clear. And I'm saying that sexuality is always going to come up. And that one way we can think about this is the notion around healing, or around the good, bad person that we constantly are trying to resist in popular narratives and discourses about, and politics about incarceration. So I don't know if that helps.
That helps a lot. Thank you.
I mean, I have to think, I thought about that too at the end. I'm like, well, this doesn't really have anything to do with that. But I had to come on here and give you all a talk. So.
No, we now have, thank you, Mary. We now have some questions populating the Q&A. If you can see them, Mary, the first is from Shannon.
Okay, so Shannon.
Perhaps you can read the questions.
Sure, so Shannon wants to know that if abolition is a process, what are its touchstones? For example, reduction of harm. How can we measure this, giving the claims about psychoanalytic arguments about foundational violences? I think this is an excellent question, and it is not mine to answer alone, because abolition is a social movement and it's a community-based movement, so that this should be a question though, right? To ask, what are our touchstones? How can we measure? I don't know, the reduction of harm. This is why Zoom sucks, because we can't think about what that means, the reduction of harm. But I know Shannon, I can talk to her about that later. But I think that in terms of measuring, I do think that the reduction of harm is often a quantifiable, it often becomes quantified because we're talking about reducing. And I think that we need to maybe resist that a bit, because then the metrics become social science data collection, which I think can be really dangerous, especially in a psychoanalytic argument. Other metrics are welcome, Shannon says. I just offered that as a possible and often an often offered metric. Okay, well, I'd love to see what other people want to put into the questions about metrics, but I do think that a reduction of suffering is one of those metrics, or a capable way of addressing suffering so that people feel heard and recognized in registers that aren't just given to us by the state, could be one metric. Again, these are, I think, communities' responsibilities to discuss and to talk about. I actually don't know. I'm gonna have to think about that, Shannon. I actually don't think that I don't know that it's not my question to answer. And I do feel like, again, the abolition is a social movement. Mm. And I feel really hesitant to answer that as an individual and to sound like an authority, especially as someone who has been I've lived a very safe life. So I think people would answer that really differently based on their experiences. Lorna asked the question. Hello, Lorna. We've never met, although you're a graduate student in my department, but COVID has kept us apart. Lorna wants to know how I'm conceptualizing the child and how we theorize from the position of the child while also addressing the fallacy of childhood. And how does notions of childhood inform our analysis of sexuality? So I am definitely thinking about the psychoanalytic child. And again, Laplanche is really helpful in that because he, among a lot of psychoanalytic thinkers, actually focus on the child and does, I think, a really magical job of teaching us to think away from the kind of inherent propulsion of the child to act in certain ways, for example. And the child is really based on this idea about, the child is formed as an internalization of the adult message. So I think that the ways that children are and are not effective in the way that they comprehend and deal with the adult messages is important to think about. I'm really interested in that as a scholar. The fallacy of childhood, I'm not really sure what you mean about how we theorize from the position of the child while also addressing the fallacy of childhood. So I think you're saying that as adults, we can never understand the child's mind and represent it. And I think that's absolutely right. And I don't think that we should even try. How does our notions of childhood inform our analysis of sexuality? Again, that's where the too soon and too late come into play for me. So I hope that Lorna and I can talk about that actually sometime in person. I don't know, does that answer? It's so hard doing this over Zoom. Okay, there's another question. How you conceptualize race and sexuality, as it seems you are using Laplanche to provide a universal understanding of sexuality in the subject. Yes, that's absolutely right. Psychoanalysis presents the subject as a universal subject. Absolutely, that is true. Unless someone cannot achieve subjectivity, for instance, if they have psychosis. The fact of the unconscious and sexuality is universal to psychoanalysis. That doesn't mean that race and gender identity and all of those things don't also play a role. And there's lots of great psychoanalysis work on race that's out there that helps us understand that. But you're absolutely right, anonymous attendee, that is a universal understanding. And it's not just Laplanche, it's all psychoanalysis.
Mary, just a moment ago, Jennifer Suchland raised her hand. Jennifer, do you want to see if you can turn your mic on and speak?
She's ready to go.
Oh, hi. Okay, cool. So it looks like I don't have video, but that's okay. But I just wanted, Mary, you requested to raise a hand, and I was like, I'm going to raise my hand.
I know, it's so good to hear your voice. Go ahead.
Hello. So such an awesome talk, and I can't wait to read the paper so I could really dwell on all that you have in there. And so and thank you for also talking about so much intense material in this bizarre, anonymous kind of way. So I know it's not easy. But okay, so a lot of what you talk about resonates with some of what I find troubling about the anti-trafficking apparatus. And, especially the idea that some criminals, so-called criminals, are diverted to special courts because they're deemed to be actually victims. And, some of what that has developed into is that you have increasingly now survivor-led organizations, anti-trafficking organizations. And you also have a kind of, you also have just sort of this, boom to memoirs and media production of formerly incarcerated and also former or survivors, trafficking survivors. So what I'm really interested in hearing you talk more about is, I totally get that there's a limitation to what a story can do because it tracks along so much of an affective register of, pulling on people's emotions, right? But do you think that structurally in some ways that the switch from having these narratives be about someone speaking on behalf of to people speaking on their own behalf makes an impact at all on that discursive landscape that's perhaps more long lasting than just, is not as fickle, I guess?
So I think so. So you want to know if more people who have experienced incarceration speak about it, is that a better strategy? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are, there's just a lot more self-narration. I mean, there's, I guess, perhaps always been, and like Survived and Punished, some of these organizations that really center the stories and the narratives, of survivors. And so, but I'm also thinking about like books and memoirs and things like this that, people are speaking on behalf of themselves.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that's partly why, I think Black Lives Matter is a real big reason why prison abolition has gained steam, because of that amazing activist resource and network. But I also think that a lot of incarcerated people are actually speaking directly to the public now through Twitter. A lot of people who are adults who are incarcerated have phones in prison. It's contraband, they're not supposed to have them, but there are a lot of people who are sharing their experiences, especially right now with COVID, from those spaces of incarceration, and they are really powerful, and they have a lot of followers, some of them. And I think that kind of direct connection, especially to someone who is incarcerated right now, they're not talking about an experience from the past, right? Something they've overcome. They're talking about it embedded, and I think those are really effective. But what I do worry about, though, is again that that kind of connection between the story and the storyteller. These are very effective storytellers, and that is a kind of seduction about a certain path of story that they want you to follow. And then when you can't stay on that path, and I think this is what you're getting at with the human trafficking thing too, right? If you don't conform to these stories that pull on the heartstrings or make effective kind of political connections, then your story doesn't get absorbed by the movement potentially. Or then again, because the public is fickle, and again, the public I use with scare quotes, those stories can only go so far, because the racism, the white supremacy is always at the ready to turn its head away from those stories. And I think that the misogynoir, for sure, right? In terms of thinking about these young people in the facility for girls. So I don't know if that.
Yeah, it does. One of the things that I've noticed too is that often those who are diverted are the ones whose narratives can reinforce the carceral system of human rights to begin with.
Yeah.
And so anything that's divergent from, those quote unquote stories of redemption, at the same time, it seems also messier than that, because I do think that, on some level, I talk to you about this another time, not take up so much space here, but you know, I'm just thinking too about the ways that narratives during the antebellum period around, you know, slave narratives and how that, you know, played such a role in abolitionism then.
Right, and then exactly the point, right, that it quickly, the white supremacist nation quickly turned that on a dime, right, through the birth of the prison, especially the Southern justice model and Jim Crow and convict slavers. So again, that's the question that abolition is trying to face, is sort of how do you make sure you don't get that response?
Thanks, Mary.
Yeah, Madhu asked in the chat whether the young women speak about abolition. And you know, it's funny, I tried to make them all abolitionists and they were not having it. All of them were like, no, we need prison. We've got to lock up the bad people. Because again, they think everybody in there is bad but themselves. Not everybody, right? There's 2 other good people in there. But they are constantly insisting, they constantly insist, even though their communities are decimated by the prison system, that we need the prison to lock up the bad people. So sure.
Questions from Shurkan and Becky Mansfield.
So sure, I think you're asking, do I have volunteers? I'm not doing this research anymore, but if you're interested in the Prison Education Project, the OPEEP, definitely reach out about ways that you can be involved in OPEEP. Nobody's doing field work right now in prisons. Dr. T. Morris and I are going to start a new project at the Ohio Reformatory for Women as soon as we can, that looks at a kind of historical race relations within the women's prison over time. So I doubt we'll have volunteers for that project, and who knows what's going to happen over the course of the spring to get that project started, but that's something that we have coming up. But feel free to email me. My dot number is 1672 and let me know what you might be interested in. And then, hey, Becky. Becky wants to know if I could speak to the broad issues about speaking, the storytelling of the self as a technology of being recognized. The ways that people are required to bear their stories in order to gain legitimacy, even as bearing is part of the problem. Yes. So I wrote a paper about that. I can send you. I wrote a little bit about that, so that with the cognitive behavioral therapy, especially at this facility, they were completely trained. They had to use specific terms even to describe their own rehabilitation. They had to do workbooks on this as well. So you're very much right that it's a technique, a technology that made them recognizable to the facility, but not necessarily to others. Everybody knew it was kind of what they had to do, so the social worker could chart it and make that, it's called like doing your program, right? You have to show that you are able to be recognizable to the prison system's metrics of achieving that rehabilitation. I'm not sure if that's what the self-narration is its own disciplinary technique. I think that's absolutely right. I think that that's part of also, let me think about this for a minute. I think that, okay, this is what I want to say about this. I think that when Becky, just type in the chat or another question if I'm not getting this right. I just want to make sure I'm doing this right. So one thing, okay, there's that technology of being recognized by the facility. Then there's the technology of being recognized by me. Okay, so in that interview itself is a kind of setup. And that's why I really wanted to talk about the space of the room, because it is important when you think about how we're in this context and how that sets up a kind of telling of the self, right? That context is very important. It's never not there. In terms of the space of the interview. I can't determine how that impacts necessarily. It doesn't determine an outcome in terms of speech and in terms of a conversation, because believe me, I never knew where these conversations were going to go. They didn't necessarily follow the questions I asked. The interviews quickly got out of my control because the girls had a sense of what they wanted to tell me. And so they were asking for my recognition of themselves. And as Bev did, she asked to have this recognition framed within this notion of her as a good person. So that was sort of the paramount recognition that she wanted me to understand. But I think that recognition in a psychoanalytic frame is never a kind of facile or superficial understanding of what someone's saying. And this is sort of what I'm trying to also argue, is that there's always messaging that's unconscious that we don't even know we're throwing at each other in the space of a conversation. And so I'm not sure I would call that a technology. I think that that is exactly what exceeds any kind of technology of recognition. Some relational psychoanalysis argue that that there are goals. For instance, Jessica Benjamin argues about achieving a kind of third position where there's a doer done to, and you can achieve a kind of third space by being able to recognize each other's unconscious in a sense, but not the fact of it, but the force of it. I don't know, Becky, if that answers your question. So far, so good. Okay.
Mary, there was a question along the way about what you mean by relational and how you're using it. Perhaps this is a good point to take that.
Sure. So relational means that there's more than one person who's trying to relate something to the other. And in that, it's just actually, that's exactly what it means. Just the relational means that we're trying to relate something, but that there's also a relationship there that's more than just words being passed, right? Between two people, that there's another kind of relation that's happening that exceeds just that kind of simplistic understanding of voices being put toward each other. And that when we come into these, maybe a conversation, for example, and you think about when you come to any conversation, you're bringing a whole host of other shit with you. You're bringing other kinds of reactions, nerves, the mood you were in, how you feel about a certain thing that just happened to you or whatever. And so when we think about that kind of relation or relational, the relational itself, then we need to account then or think about the complexity of that relation that is happening in the particular present moment. Okay, that it's way more complicated than just what is happening in that moment. I mean, maybe what happens with Zoom that is so disturbing. I mean, I feel totally anxious not knowing who these, 36 participants are now out there, that I can't relate to you. I can't even look at your eyes or have a sense of whether or not you're itching, you're getting your backpacks ready to leave the room. Like, it's weird to be on this totally blank space and not have a kind of relational sensibility. For some people, that's very comforting. For me, it's not, because there's all the other contexts that some people are trying to gauge. Maybe even an insecurity in not being able to engage you all to know whether or not you understand any of this, right? So I hope that anonymous attendee, that makes sense in terms of the relational, but if you're a geographer, I think that that's probably something that intuitively through your training, you're also understanding, because we think about spatiality in similar terms. I hope that.
Mary, if I could interject briefly, it's 4:40 now, and we just received another question from Shrita, which I'll let you take in a moment, Mary, but why don't we say that this will be the last question, and you can take your time replying, and then we'll wrap up our conversation.
Great, sure. So that's Sarita. Hey, Sarita. So Sarita wants to know that given that Ohio is rarely incarcerating girls now, do you know what adjudication for Bev would have looked like today? It still really, really depends where you catch your charge. If you look at the Department of Youth Services, there were 18 girls held by the state of Ohio in facilities last fiscal year. But there are also a lot of girls that are held in county facilities or diverted to other kind of community programs. I really don't know. It really depends on the county. So for instance, Cuyahoga County still has the highest number of girls adjudicated and held. Columbus doesn't even come in the top 5, or Franklin County doesn't even hit the top 5 because there are so many diversion programs. So it really depends on your county. Now, I don't really want to say what county Bev was from, but probably she would have done a shorter stint at the local prison there and probably been diverted. Almost all girls are now, because of the nature of the kind of offending, but also a lot of girls are put into residential healthcare facilities now, which are very prison-like. I used to volunteer at one here in Columbus before COVID at Pomegranate, which actually was in the news a lot. And I think the state just ended its contract with them for all kinds of problems. But disturbingly, a lot of girls then were put in residential mental health care facilities. So now the caseload of girls on the mental health care caseload is 100% of girls adjudicated felons in Ohio. And that creates its own kind of pathology of girls offending that scholars have tracked for decades now, right? That if you are gender nonconforming or not feminine or Black, that you are more likely to be seen as pathological and treated through mental health problems. Having said that, they're also, I don't know, yeah, they are better in terms of the kind of services they provide, but they're still locked into a unit. They're still not, actually, they couldn't even go outside at this one facility because there's no outside space. I tried to make tie-dye with them and there's nowhere to do it. Wow. Yeah, they're really cruel, but probably, I think that's a great question, Sarita, so thanks. I think that probably she would have done very little time in a juvenile correctional facility, but maybe been diverted because she didn't have a stable home into a mental health care facility. Guys, thanks for hanging out this long. I appreciate you all staying.
Mary, despite what I just told you, the questions won't stop. Lorna slipped one in under the wire. Would you mind taking one last question from Lorna? How is the idea of sexuality arriving too soon or too late complicated?
Yeah.
When we think of it in terms of Black female sexuality.
That's a great question because sexuality always arrives too soon for Black girls. Because in white supremacy and heteropatriarchy, white supremacist heteropatriarchy, Black girls they aren't allowed a childhood, right? Someone actually just gave a talk about this, I think it was yesterday, through the Kerwin Institute, a social work faculty member, and I think they recorded it, Lorna, and I can send you the link for the Zoom recording if you want to watch that. But to Laplanche, the too soonness happens during infancy with your caregiver. So it's not sort of something that happens, I mean, that could definitely happen in terms of a multiracial household or maybe a non-familial setting, but it's really, we're talking about very young infants, babies. But I take the point and it's an important one. So I'll follow up with you on that presentation if you would like to watch it.
Very good. Well, thanks, Mary, for taking the last question there. And thank you all for tuning in this Friday afternoon to this wonderful talk. Mary, one of the strangest things about this COVID era Zoom format for these talks is that typically at the end of one of these,
I know, where's my bling? Where's my geography bling? Darla, come on.
And we have a loud round of applause, and so you get to enjoy the affect of,
I don't care about the applause. I want the bling.
Cheering. But Mary, we are all cheering right now, and we're so thrilled that you gave such a great talk, and incredibly, I must say, thought-provoking as always.
Oh, good. So, well, that's the point.
And I mean that genuinely. And let me say from the bottom of my heart, thank you for this wonderful talk and for your friendship. Joel, for inviting me. I appreciate it. And for being the critical scholar that you are. And to the rest of you, before you all sign off, don't forget, Geography Department has 3 more talks coming this spring. So check out our website for more details. And one of those talks is going to be given by Becky Mansfield, who you were just hearing from silently in the Q&A. So thanks again, Mary, and hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks so much for coming. Go have a beer.